now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This one is an issue for me. My father was a state trooper in Georgia, and I thank you for your service and also in the military as well. But it's very disturbing to me. As I was growing up, one of the things I always found was that when one officer did something wrong, that everything else got painted. And you were basically assuming that everybody was the same. This disturbs me in the sense of it was an overall, the storefront operations were overall looked after from D.C. but handled in the different agencies, in the different areas. I'm going to concentrate specifically on Atlanta because some of your comments today are not consistent with the actions that happened in Atlanta, and I want to talk about that. In Atlanta, the Atlanta Blaze, the storefront operation bought stolen goods, including guns stolen from police squad cars. How many stolen police weapons did ATF agents in Atlanta recover?
If you give me, I know a bit about Atlanta Blaze because it is one of the historical ones. It's not something that was going on when I came on board.
And I understand that, but the hearing title today was Undercover Storefront Operations involving all of these. I would have expected you to have been at least briefed on all of the ones that were going on, especially given the problems that existed in many of these.
Well, I do understand that in Atlanta there were some weapons that ended up coming into the storefront that were the result of thefts from other police officers.
What did the ATF agents do with the weapons when they purchased them, and where are those weapons now?
I believe the case is completed. I'm not certain, as I sit here today, where the weapons are now.
Okay. Are you aware that the Atlanta Police Department spent considerable resources interviewing witnesses and attempting to recover the weapons because ATF agents did not report the guns as recovered? And then why didn't the ATF promptly return the guns to the Atlanta Police Department?
Well, I'm not aware of that. I
Okay.
am now.
Did you look over this case? Did you look over these storefront operations before coming to testify today?
I spent a lot of time with Fearless. I spent less time with the four that occurred before I got on board at ATF.
Okay, but knowing that this was an overall, I mean, I'm concerned here in the sense that this was a storefront and there were multiple operations to know this. Going back to another one, there was an ATF agent bought one high-point pistol stolen from a police car a week after it was just taken from in Christmas 2010. I realize this was before you. As of November 2013, the Fulton County Police Department weapons still had the firearm listed as stolen. A representative stated the department had not received any notification that the weapon was recovered. I'll ask the question, I assume the answer at this point. Has the ATF returned this to Fulton County?
I'm not sure if they have.
Has the ATF informed the Fulton County that the ATF agents had recovered this weapon?
I'm not certain.
It's interesting to me, and this is why I said earlier that the interesting part of me was that St. Louis, there seems to be this wonderful cooperation between local enforcement and the ATF, but in Atlanta, there wasn't this. And right now, we're still looking at this. I'll ask another question. Does ATF have a policy about notification of other law enforcement agencies when weapons or other possessions are obtained by ATF agents, either by purchase through a storefront operation or otherwise?
I know that we do run traces at a storefront when we
No, that's not what I asked. I asked, do you have a policy of notifying other agencies when they recover or buy stolen police equipment?
I don't want to step out of bounds here and say for certain that we do, but I would be surprised if we did not have a policy about recovering weapons that are traced back to a law enforcement
Which they have known. Okay, that's concerning in itself, and I'm going to ask that be made available to my office in this committee as soon as possible. That should be an easy find. Someone right behind you probably already has that information. If you don't have a policy, that needs to change. If you do have a policy, I really ask why it's not being followed in this situation. In looking at this and talking about the cooperation between agencies supposedly in St. Louis that my colleague spoke of, why was this seemingly run so differently in Atlanta where you have agencies, other law enforcement agencies spending a lot of time trying to track down their own weapons when ATF had the weapons? Why is there such a disconnect here?
Well, let me first say that we have good working relationships with Atlanta and Fulton County and people all over
in this
Georgia.
Case it's different.
A disconnect in an individual circumstance, an isolated circumstance about the reporting mechanisms going back and people looking for weapon and not cooperating, that's disappointing to me to hear. So I understand your concerns. about the lack of communication.
Well, I'm still concerned about where these weapons actually are. There's a number of things going on, and you used an interesting word just a moment ago, and it was based on the questions of the woman who had got investigated. You said that you keep a list, and you used the word naughty. It's pretty interesting to me because I think that wording is good because it reminded me of the song that we're making a list, we're checking it twice to see who's naughty or nice, and maybe the naughty part here was they applied for a C4 permit, and that might be why they got more scrutiny than they should have. This Atlanta operation bothers me. I do want to hear those answers, and please get those to my office in this committee as soon as possible. Thank you for your service, and thank you for being here.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Grissom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director Jones. I appreciate that several times during this hearing that you've talked about the problems that you're aware of and your obligation and efforts in the with ATF to make these efforts productive and to minimize risk to the public and to maximize the operations and to take responsibility for the things that don't work. And I absolutely appreciate that. And considering, as many of us have focused on local operations, and that ATF did conduct a storefront operation in Albuquerque in 2010, I think I share an obligation in the same degree to assure that the problems with the Inspector General and the ATF and the public are adequately addressed. And like many other members here today, I'm specifically concerned about how your agency, in fact, interacts with persons with mental illness or mentally disabled individuals. I want to get right to policies and training. It is my understanding that the FBI, local law enforcement, in fact, I know unequivocally that local law enforcement in Albuquerque use CIT. So they're crisis intervention teams, that these teams, their effort is to calm persons who've got a mental illness or disorder or an issue in lieu of arresting them. And we know that that minimizes risk, quite frankly, on both sides. And I did a quick, right here sitting in this committee, just a quick search to see how easy it is to find what kind of training and policies exist. And in fact, it's clear that there is substance abuse recognition, cultural sensitivity. There is a training on developmental disorders, personality disorders, and then I could go on because the list that I found in a quick search were fairly exhaustive, giving me the impression that there is a considerable body of training to help someone identify when they're dealing with a population or an individual and in this situation. And I want to know, do folks in ATF take part in this training?
Well, as I stated before, Congresswoman, that's something that is really important to us, given some of the things that we've learned over the last year or so. It's not only unique to ATF, but I think, the Albuquerque Police Department, police departments around the country are in a position where they need to have enhanced, not just people who are developmentally disabled, but people with mental illness. Because those circumstances, and particularly in the work that ATF does, where you've got that street-level interaction, it's important to have these
But you've repeatedly say that what you really do is deal with sort of conduct, but that there's no way to identify an individual per se. And I want you to be, I also recognize you've got to be cautious about creating an environment where we're just discriminatory in every operation. But you've known for quite some time. These trainings have been available and around for a long time, at least a decade. That's my personal knowledge in my community. And I guess we could argue today that in a place like Albuquerque, they might need some significant retooling. But did you do that a year and a half ago? Have you been doing since it was identified? Are you doing that training right now, given the circumstances?
Well, absent specific public safety threat, we don't target developmentally challenged individuals. As you mentioned, we target conduct.
But you are clearly engaged now in a situation where you know that you have these problems, and as a result, seems to me that training is a good thing. Are you engaging ATF in these training protocols that clearly exist in like operations and for like law enforcement officials in the Department of Justice and in local police forces? Are you?
We've had discussion about how we integrate that into our training.
So
at
you
all
haven't done
levels.
it, you're looking at it?
The ones that you identified, the sort of the prepackaged or whatever the Los Angeles Police Department's done, or?
Well, the FBI's got it, so I'm going to guess that these are packages, if we're going to call them that. I would hope that these are sophisticated, evidence-based training protocols that exist in the Department of Justice that should be readily available for a model like ATF. And I am flabbergasted that they're not available to you, that you're not utilizing them. It seems to me that you then don't have any written policies or procedures to deal with these issues. And I would then ask, since my time is up, the following: that my expectation is, since we share a role in making sure that we have best practices, we mitigate risk both to officers and absolutely to the public, that you immediately replicate these policies and procedures, make them relevant to the operations that you're responsible for, and you bring that evidence that you have a protocol and a program in place for training immediately back to this committee for our review and discussion, because again, I don't understand why that's not the case.
I thank the gentlelady. Did you have any answer? I didn't want to cut you off.
It's noted. The suggestions.
Noted is
Noted
it is.
and
We now go to the gentleman
appreciated.
from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Director, thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you a quick question. I hope you can kind of summarize with some adjectives. What was the ATF like before you were sworn in? Could you kind of?
Generally speaking, I had a lot of interaction going back 20 years from AUSA time, and ATF was one of those organizations that I enjoyed working with, both as a prosecutor and as U.S. Attorney first and second time. I have a lot of respect for the work that they did with me personally and in Minnesota generally, and it's unfortunate the developments that's happened in certain field divisions across in your part of the world.
Oh, I mean, that's where I want to go, because we had some really bad habits.
Figured as much.
Wouldn't you agree we had some bad habits down in the Phoenix field office?
Bad things happen. Sometimes bad things
Well,
happen.
but I mean, you said the word naughty, for those of us on one side of the law, and now the other side of the law has to be held accountable the same way. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
I mean, when I would look at it from the outside. I'm a dentist impersonating a politician, Mr. Jones. So I look at structure, and you have to hold people accountable for decisions and process. Do you agree?
I agree with that, sir.
And there are certain actions that require termination.
Depending on the actions in the government setting, yes, there are certain things that would cross that line. And of course, the public sector's got a little bit more structure than the private sector in terms of terminating somebody's employment.
So I would tell, the lack of faith from the private sector or our constituents is that bureaucrats aren't held to the same accountability. Would you kind of agree with that?
Not necessarily.
Well, I would very agree, because if you get on Main Street America, they find that bureaucrats have a whole different aspect of accountability. So I want to highlight some things, okay? First of all, I'd like to enter into the record a letter to you from the Josephine Terry, Brian Terry's mom. So
Without objection, so ordered.
and I want to highlight some of the inquisitions here. So I'm going to come back to, I phrased my lead up here. You're familiar with Inspector General Michael Horowitz's summary comprehensive report, a review of ATF's operations, Fast and Furious, and related materials, are you not?
I am.
In that case, and I want to cite for her because she does it so eloquently, identified several current Department of Justice and ATF employees who bore particular responsibility for the many mistakes made in Operation Fast and Furious. These employees included ATF agents Hope McAllister, David Voth, George Gillett, William Newell, and Emery Hurley, Michael Morrissey. And we understand these individuals have continued their employment with the Department of Justice despite the findings of the Inspector General's report. Now, it's come to our attention that the ATF's Professional Review Board have previously recommended termination for at least some of these individuals. Is that true?
We've provided that information, and
Is that true? Yes or no?
that material's been provided.
Yeah, yes or no?
That material's been provided.
So it's a yes, right?
Yes.
Okay. Why weren't these followed through on?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Were there any terminations? I mean, for example, let's just take one, William Newell. Nobody's been fired, sir.
There are people who have retired. There are people who have been disciplined.
I don't consider, what I'd like to do is enter into the record a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice to you, Mr. Chairman, dated April 1st, 2014, outlining these summaries.
Without objection, it'll be placed in the
It
record.
doesn't show that. I mean, there is no accountability for Fast and Furious within this. And from a guy that ran his own dental practice of accountability, it seems that when we come into the place of a service, and the head of an ATF that is dysfunctional, at least when you start looking at the Phoenix office, when you have such a quandary with Fast and Furious, that we would actually hold people accountable. This was hardly unaccountable. The Brian Terry family has no answers whatsoever. Wouldn't you agree?
That's unfortunate that communication has not been what it should be in terms of anyone who's lost a person in the line of duty.
Well, I want to highlight it even further because we had this conversation with a gentleman from Atlanta. The Terry family was talking to Michelle Terwilliger, the special FBI agent, about communication about Atlanta. And it seems like we got problems all the way around in communications with other law enforcement officers. Imagine to the shock on learning that the members of the ATF Field Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Arizona had chosen to keep the important piece of information about one of those guns found at the Brian Terry murder was not brought forward. I mean, once again, our gentleman was talking about Atlanta not talking. We understand there was problems in Milwaukee with the FBI and communications. Does ATF have a problem playing with other law enforcement offices?
No.
Then my question to Mr. Meadows is that why wouldn't we want to play in Chicago, the highest rate of death of violence with guns? Why wouldn't we want to work with those? I mean, it's just an exercise of communication, right?
The gentleman's time has expired, but you may answer.
Well, we work very closely with federal, state, and local in Chicago and every place that we're at. Our partnerships with both our federal brothers and sisters within the department and at the local police level are absolutely critical to us performing our mission. And that partnership includes communication. And so while it's not perfect across the country and while personalities do impact sometimes that level of communication, organizationally, that is something that we highly value, and we couldn't do our job without that partnership.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Jones. I was at another hearing, but I did want to be here to hear your testimony, at least to ask a question. First of all, I commend the ATF for looking for innovative, risk perhaps bearing ways to get at gun running in our society. I'm going to defer to your expertise. I know this much: thugs consistently outsmart law enforcement, so we can't stay ahead of them by tailoring to the location what you think will work there. And if all we do is second guess without having the available expertise, then I'm not sure we're going to get at it. So I'm not going to tell you or wonder why you haven't done one of these storefronts and this or that. City, I would like to know off the record whether there has been any such storefront here in the District of Columbia. So I'd appreciate your writing our office on that question. We would be a city not unlike Milwaukee. Now, Milwaukee has, like the district, has declining crime. They had one of these storefronts. I don't know if we do, but they had one. And some guns were stolen from an agent's vehicle. And, of course, that is one of the risks that you always have when there's a storefront, or for that matter, in any area where there are people who want to get at guns and can't use them. After the Milwaukee experience, you ordered the Office of Professional Responsibility and Security Operations to conduct a full investigation. I have seen that report. I'm pleased to say it pulls no punches. I do know that the field agents, in the absence of guidance, were trying to put together ways on their own how to run a storefront operation, and that bothered me, that there was no guidance on something as risky and I think, frankly, worth the innovation as one of these operations. After that professional responsibility report, did you take any actions in response, Mr. Jones?
We took actions both with respect to reviewing how they were operated. We took action with respect to the lessons learned, both from a resource standpoint, from a management standpoint, and we took action to try to minimize the chance that those issues identified in Milwaukee didn't happen again.
Well, Mr. Jones, there was no written guidance. Did you develop a manual or other operations guidance after the Milwaukee
That's one of the
incidents?
things that did emerge from that, sort of the level of understanding, because we have a cadre of experienced agents, but sometimes that knowledge is difficult. So one of the things that we've done is generate sort of a best practices manual, and that's separate and apart from what's in our order with respect to undercover operations and specifically storefront operations. That's more the parameters of what the rules of the road are. This secondary document and the follow-on training, when they're done, is sort of a go-by. And it's law enforcement sensitive, but it does talk about the things that you should consider, the things that need to be considered to successfully operate a storefront. And that's been memorialized in a storefront operations manual.
I'm not sure the committee staff has had an opportunity to review this manual. Have you submitted the manual to the committee?
I believe because of the sensitivity with sort of the methodologies that it may have been reviewed. We've had staff over to ATF headquarters to look at manuals, but of course it does.
Well,
no
I would
good for us.
appreciate your submitting the manual so the committee could take a look at it. I think it would help, frankly, when I consider some of the questions that have been raised, for people to know that there is written guidance and how that guidance proceeds.
If the gentlelady would yield.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I would certainly join with you. I do want to be careful that manuals that are not available to the public, if we take them into the committee as committee documents and they become broadly available normally. So
Well, I certainly didn't think they'd become broadly available, because then the thugs would have them.
If members of your staff would like an in-camera review, and after an in-camera review you want specific portions to be provided to the committee, I would join with you in it, but I would prefer that we continue the process whenever we have that kind of sensitive information of having staff see it, and only if we believe we need some portion do we request that portion. It's also less burdensome on the agency.
Go ahead, Mr. Jones.
I understand that there was an invite to have staff come over to our shop and look at it. And then, as the chair mentioned, if anything piques your interest, we can do follow-up. But there is a certain level of sensitivity about an operational manual migrating to the public.
Surely. Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, Mr. Jones. I would like my staff to be able to see some of this as well, because, as I said, this is a city that had a high gun incidents gone down, and would be very interested in looking at what you're doing with respect to these storefronts. So as long as my staff could also see that, I would certainly understand the admonitions of the chairman and of you, Mr. Jones. And thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. We now go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Mr. Jones, thank you for coming to testify today.
Thank you,
It's
Mr.
quite an opportunity and honor to be able to ask you questions. I'm an avid gun collector, and I try to convince my wife these are investments, but she says, how are they investments if you're never going to sell them? And she's got a point, but it causes me to wonder, and also watching some collectors who've been prosecuted and arrested, causes me to wonder if the collectors and the firearms dealers, and in fact the ATF itself, wouldn't be better served if we had some very bright lines drawn between what is a straw purchaser and who is not, and also who is a dealer and who is not, you kind of left to interpret a very gray area. And I've always wondered, wouldn't it be helpful if Congress defined that line a little bit better for you, or somebody did, between dealer and collector? For instance, number of sales per year?
It's always helpful to have Congress define in a statute where certain lines are drawn. It's difficult on occasion for us with regulatory authority to do that with clarity all of the time, both because of the process and the dynamics, as you mentioned.
But you think it could be helpful if we did? I just think it helps people who want to obey the law. I think it helps them to have it drawn very brightly. So that's something that I would advocate for. This next question may not seem related to this hearing, but it is, because maybe we can avoid another hearing if I could just get one question answered. Are you familiar with Ares Armor? They were recently rated in California. They make 80% polymer lowers for AR-15s. You familiar with them?
I am familiar with that.
So-
That is an active criminal investigation.
Understood.
So I will say up front, there are limitations about that specific phenomenon.
Understood. But, we can, the search warrant is public and these sort of things, so I think we can talk some about it. Now, one thing that was requested was a list of their 5,000 customers. Now, Ares Armor maintains that they're not in the business of manufacturing firearms. If this is true, then what would justify the ATF having a list of their 5,000 customers?
Well, I hope you understand, Mr. Massey, that there are certain things that are on the public record, in particular with the TRO. My understanding is the search warrant's still sealed. It is an active criminal investigation. But generally speaking, I think that in those circumstances where we're investigating the potential that, this isn't specific to Ares Armor, but one of the things that would be of interest for someone who may be illegally manufacturing firearms is the list of who they've sold them to, not necessarily to look at the list, but to see if there are witness leads about the circumstances of.
But that'll be up to a court to decide whether Ares Armor was manufacturing firearms, not Congress and not the ATF. Ultimately, this will be held in court.
Well, I think in between, there's prosecutors involved too that would have to.
Right, but a jury gets to decide at the end of the day.
Yes, they do.
And so if the jury finds that they weren't manufacturing firearms, can we have some assurance from you that that list of 5,000 people that they were selling material to won't be kept by the ATF?
Well, I think that in a normal circumstance of investigations, that that would be something that would migrate into a prosecutor's office, and at the conclusion of a case, then they're.
I would hope if the names, the 5,000 names were acquired, and the case were found not to be, if Ares weren't found to be manufacturing firearms, that you would destroy that list because the list was otherwise ill-gotten. Quick question on this particular case. In Wichita, Kansas, agents let felons leave a store with guns on at least 3 occasions. One man brought in 2 AK-47s to sell, but agents only had enough money to buy one. The man, a felon, was allowed to leave with the other AK-47. And this was at Bandit Trading in Wichita, Kansas, one of the storefronts. Why would ATF agents let a felon leave a storefront with an AK-47?
I'm not certain, Congressman, of all the circumstances, but I think that in an undercover setting, first and foremost, we may not know that the individual's prohibited until after the fact. And so, someone who comes into the store, even if there's a suspicion that these are crime guns, the status of the person selling the gun isn't always known right out of the block.
If the person were known, do you think that the agents should have alerted local law enforcement that there was a felon in possession of AK-47?
I think if they had an opportunity with cover teams and right staffing, that the circumstances may warrant away from the premises some intervention.
According to my information, this weapon was never recovered. Is that true?
I'm not certain, as I sit here today, of all the details of that particular circumstance, other than the fact that there may have been a lack of knowledge about someone being prohibited when they tried to sell the weapon.
If you found out that your agents let a felon leave the store with an AK-47 knowingly, would you be concerned? Would you
Yes.
follow up on that for us?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Director, I'm going to be very brief with one quick round of questioning. Monitored case program, the subject to today. How frequently was Operation Fearless briefed to the ATF headquarters, to your knowledge?
Well, we've spent a lot of, thank you for that question, Congressman. We've spent a lot of time on monitored case program because one of the things that were recommendations in the IG report in Fast and Furious is the lack of communication as to what was going on out in the field. And so the monitored case program that we have in place isn't the same that it was a year ago or 2 years ago. It's grown. We've learned more. I think at the core of it is this push-pull dynamic of what comes up and how we get it, and what's pulled up and how we get it. The circumstance with respect to Operation Fearless was it did not migrate up the food chain. It got briefed up. Not all the information on the ground got briefed to the SAC, which means it didn't get to the Deputy Assistant Director. That's a phenomenon we've worked hard to make sure, both by looking at our own case management system and proactively engaging with the special agents in charge about what's coming up.
If I could interpret that, I think accurately, that would mean that the answer to the question of how frequently was headquarters briefed, the answer was that you weren't. It didn't get to you, is what you're saying.
Well, I don't, there are a number of cases on the monitored case program that I don't get a personal briefing on.
Well, I actually asked headquarters, so I was including your deputy.
The Deputy Assistant Directors do, based on their region, have regular interaction. And Fearless was up to the Deputy Assistant Director in terms of the information flow, but I think the glitch that we learned was what the special agent was hearing was positives and not problems.
Okay, so is it fair to say that although our information shows that Operation Fearless was briefed to headquarters 9 times, that in fact those briefings were insufficient to uncover the flaws in Operation Fearless?
Yes.
How often were you briefed on monitored case programs in I guess what you'd say, a setting in which you knew you were being briefed on monitored cases?
We have monthly meetings.
So essentially in 12 months, 12 times, roughly?
Yes.
Okay. Were you ever briefed on Operation Fearless separate from the monitored case program in some capacity? The deputy come in and say, I want to talk to you about it.
Me personally?
Yes, you personally. No. And this is redundant somewhat, but did you ever meet with anybody at Maine Justice concerning Operation Fearless?
No.
Did you ever meet with anybody at DOJ's criminal division about Operation Fearless?
In terms of time frame, I mean, after we launched the
I mean, if the answer is yes, then the follow-up would be, what was the first time and what was the subject?
I mean, there were discussions with the Justice Department, and particularly the IG, when we launched internal affairs to go out there and do the dive. But until certain issues came to light, no. This was Field Division, United States Attorney's Office, Milwaukee Police Department, February to September of 2012. So it's not an extended storefront operation. It was up and down pretty quickly, and then the concerns were brought to light.
So would it be fair to say that your first meeting with DOJ, particularly criminal division, would have been after the end of Operation Fearless as an ongoing operation?
In terms of the criminal division, I don't recall any interaction there. I mean, I brief up on challenges that we're having, and we've talked to the United States Attorney about cases generated out of that operation.
But you didn't talk to anyone at the DAG's office or anyone of that sort?
We have regular meetings, and it's sort of, here's where we're at in terms of our look-see at.
So is it possible that in the last 12 months, 14 months, you did have conversations about Operation Fearless with the DAG?
I think it would be fairer to say we've had conversations about storefronts generally, but I don't recall having specifics on this particular operation in Milwaukee.
Final question, I guess, following up on that. So this has been an area of interest of the Deputy Attorney General, the storefronts and the concerns about operations.
We all, collectively, all the DOJ law enforcement community, U.S. attorneys, and the Deputy Attorney General have had a lot of discussions about managing risk in the last several years. New policies across the board within the Department of Justice applicable to all law enforcement entities and U.S. attorney offices. So there's been discussions with the DAG about managed risk and information flow, generally.
Okay. Mr. Cummings, do you have anything? Yes. If you don't mind, I'll let you close. We'll go to Mr. Jordan briefly.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Jones, just real quickly, just back to where Mr. DeSantis was, I want to be clear. You were acting director of ATF when ATF visited Ms. Engelbrecht's place of business. You've been acting director since, my understanding, since August of 2011? Have you been acting director since August 2011?
My first day in that building was August, I think it was the last day in August. August
Okay,
30th.
so you were acting director when ATF visited Ms. Engelbrecht in 12 and 13?
Yes.
Okay. I also want to ask you about, I mentioned briefly at the end of my first round, Mr. Tom Perez, because we had a hearing in this committee regarding what took place in St. Paul, what we've called the quid pro quo. Now, just quickly, and I guess my interest is because Mr. Perez was, at the Civil Rights Division, and Ms. Bosserman is the person heading the investigation in the IRS. I'm just curious your interaction with Mr. Perez and why he, this is in your role as U.S. Attorney, but while you were also acting director of ATF, when he contacted you about the Newell case and the fact that you had career attorneys recommending intervention, and then that was subsequently changed and you did not intervene based on conversations you had with Mr. Perez. Can you walk me through that real briefly?
That's more than briefly.
I understand.
A lot of discussion during my confirmation process about those interactions. It's fair to say I've never talked to Mr. Perez about anything related to Ms. Engelbrecht, and that my focus really since the end of August 2011.
How did it happen? You had career attorneys tell you, I'm just curious, you had career attorneys tell you we need to intervene, this is a good case, $62 million potentially of fraud against the federal government, and then you decide not to do that. We had, during the hearing we had on this issue in this committee, the Democrat witness told us that's highly unusual when you have career attorneys recommending you take a certain course of action and then it subsequently changed. How was that decision reached? Did you agree with Mr. Perez? Did you ultimately sign off on it, or how was it decided?
Well, that is something that's beyond the scope of why I'm here today, and I'm not really prepared to go into a deep dive as to what went on with my experiences as United States Attorney.
I would argue it has a lot to do with this committee. We've spent countless hours investigating the IRS situation and how that Mr. Perez at the Civil Rights Division, how Barbara Bosserman gets to be the lead investigator in the Justice Department investigation of this. We think Tom Perez is involved. I'm trying to figure out how this may relate. We know Mr. Perez flew to St. Paul, got things changed. We know that the United States government did not intervene even though there were millions of dollars at stake that we could have potentially recovered. We know that didn't happen after Tom Perez talked to you and after your career attorney said we should intervene. So I think it's highly relevant.
I provided a substantial amount of information to Senator Grassley's staff on the record that I'm sure that they would share you transcripts of my prior testimony.
Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank you. Now we go to the ranking member.
Just want to close up. The Director, first of all, I want to thank you for your testimony. It has been very helpful, and I think you shed a bright light on the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I do emphasize good. There's a lot of good here. But on the other hand, as you said, I mean, it's got to be right. It's got to be done right. As I was sitting here, I was just thinking about you can never say thank you enough. And I again say thank you to you and to the ATF. Let me tell you why. On Good Friday of last year, I went to observe an autopsy of a young African-American man who had been killed, shot to death by some so-called friends. And I intentionally wanted to go and see an autopsy of a gunshot victim. And it's interesting, when I watched that autopsy, they apparently shot him in the head, right behind the ear, and then it came out over the eye. The bullet came out, one bullet. And when I looked at the hole, I swear, it looked about half the size of a penny on one side, but on the other side, it looked like the side of about a quarter. And then they showed me something like a CAT scan of what happened when the bullet went through his head and how everything just exploded. And I followed that case because I was just curious. And then, of course, I had the issue with the situation with my nephew at Old Dominion, who 3 years ago was murdered. Again, some people came into his room at 5 o'clock in the morning, third year, honor student at Old Dominion, killed him, blasted his head. The next day, a few days later, I went to his apartment, his brains and blood splattered all over the walls. That's what your folk tried to prevent. And I want them to know that it is so very, very important. They may not get all the thanks, and I know they've been through some hell. I know they have. We watched the Fast and Furious situation. The mistakes were clearly made, and I was so glad to see you come in, and that's one of the reasons why I went to your swearing in, because I just have so much hope for this organization because it is so important. And I think that we need to make sure that under all of these circumstances that we get it right, because I think when anything goes wrong, then it's as if it's the wrong, but nobody pays a lot of attention to the right. But the mission must go on. The mission must go on. There are kids in my neighborhood, who tell me they can get a gun if they've got the money faster than they can get a cigarette. That's real. And so you all have a tough situation to deal with. But I am so thankful that the ATF exists, because if it didn't, we'd have to invent it. The expertise that your people bring, the dedication, and I don't want what happened with regard to Fast and Furious to have a chilling effect on any of them. I want them to understand that they've got a mission that's bigger than them. And it's about trying to make sure that people are safe, trying to make sure that they address the issues of just of guns being in the hands of the wrong people doing the wrong things. And so again, I just want to say thank you. I'm looking forward to our briefing. I'm hoping that the policies that your team has brought together now, put in place, will address the kind of issues that came up in Fast and Furious. I'm hoping that with regard to the storefront situation, that things are in place so that we don't have to go through this kinds of situation again. But I think the best words that you could have said that were music to my ears, and as I close, is this, is that if we cannot do it right, we're not going to do it at all. And it reminds me of my first trip to Israel many years ago, and they had a saying that just rings in my head. Everywhere I go, it was a saying. It said, if we are not better, we will not be. if we are not better, we will not be. And so I thank you for pursuing the best. And the chairman and I were just talking, we were kind of joking about you, said, who wants this job, you know? but
We think some of you other than that.
but we know that it's a love of country, it's a love of just trying to make a difference and have an impact in your time on this earth. And so we appreciate you.
You know, with respect to that last comment, I think that, you know, I have a lot of friends that ask me too, but over the last 2.5, 3 years, I've gotten to know this organization. I've been to every field division. I've met a lot of people outside of headquarters, agents, investigators, support staff. They have a great mission, and this is really a great organization. They understand, we all understand that we've got to refill that well of credibility because of recent events and mistakes. But I can share with you without any hesitation that the folks at ATF are dedicated to a very important mission. It's probably the most resilient law enforcement organization I've ever come across, and in the face of a lot of adversity related to both the enforcement of the Gun Control Act, to recent snafus and mistakes made for a lot of different reasons. They are tough as nails, and they are completely dedicated to the mission of making our communities safer from gun violence and arson and people who would use explosives to hurt folks. So it's an honor to really be at the helm of this organization.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you for your testimony. We're going to stand adjourned, and if you don't mind, I think the ranking member and I'd like to see you in the back for a couple minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.